Hey everyone, welcome to Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. Today's podcast is actually going to be one of those discussions because they really speak to the issue of trust. And as our guest today, we'll talk about a minimum standard of excellence to help patients trust the products they depend on. As you may know, I'm an attorney. I'm a pharmacist. I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about medical devices, consider cannabis, obsess over pharmacy, this is the podcast for you. So I do these video podcasts because they're a lot of fun and I find myself learning something new each time. So if you are listening to this, I'd love to hear from you. So please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can find me on DarshanTalks on Twitter or just go to our website at DarshanTalks.com. But let's talk now about today's podcast. Today's podcast is with a stalwart in the medical science liaison field and in the medical affairs field in general. So if you are a pharmacist going, I'm really tired of being in retail and I want to make a meaningful difference, and I don't feel like I am in the role I'm in. If I'm in hospital and I feel like I need a better career ladder. I'm in industry and I'm working on regulatory, but I really miss patients. This is a conversation that maybe we need to start having, and this is sort of why I was excited when he agreed to be on the podcast. So today's guest is the is the founder and CEO of ACMA and is an investor in various startups in the life sciences. Our guest for today, William Solomon. Will, good to have you on. Thank you for coming on.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Darshan.
We already have someone, Christine Naro, who's excited to be here, and she's excited about what we're going to talk about, and we haven't even started, so there's that.
That's great. Hi, Christine.
So, Will, let's talk a little bit about, let's start with the basics. We've discussed medical affairs a few different times on the podcast, and for people who don't know, we'll try to throw some links in there so you can listen to them. And MSLs obviously play a critical role, but we've never actually focused on MSLs. So let's start with the beginning. What are MSLs, and why is it important that that role stay where it is and sort of become more important potentially?
That's a great question. So MSLs ultimately are really today the face of the industry in terms of providing education to the thought leaders in medicine. So think about them, and I think about them kind of in doing two primary things: is educating the community on the disease state, on a lot of the in-depth scientific information of a product or a device, and also in helping the community generate new data and information to help inform prescribers as to how to best use a product or device. And in the last decade, the number of MSLs has skyrocketed. It's actually a growth of over 300%. And we see it all over, not just in the United States, but all over the world. More and more companies are seeing the value of MSLs. And, I think part of that is really the demand that the healthcare providers have to have more in-depth information from people that, they see as peers that are medically trained.
So, I mean, that sounds great in principle, but why can't we just have sales reps do this?
So sales reps certainly carry a function. I think, part of the problem, as given your background, salespeople are incentivized by sales. And that can cause a conflict of interest, number one. Number two, salespeople, generally speaking, not all the time, there's certainly exceptions. Generally speaking, don't have that clinical training, that clinical background or scientific background. So it's maybe more difficult for them to get into a lot of in-depth information. And today, as we've moved into a lot more specialty biologics and more complex mechanisms of action, you really need to have individuals that have that in-depth scientific and clinical training.
So are you suggesting that as we continue, there is this, for lack of a better term, 1-2 punch of sales reps and MSLs? But do they need to be working in conjunction as you see it, or do they need to have that Chinese wall that separates them? What do you think is the industry standard now, or what should we be aiming for?
Well, the industry standard definitely in the US, I would say, and in Europe, is to have that wall, that firewall between the two. So we have, as you know, we have the board certification in medical affairs, and we have learners in over 75 countries. So we have a good kind of global view of what happens in medical affairs in the MSL space outside of the US and Europe. And it's not like that everywhere. Ideally, that's what you should have. You should have that firewall. But again, it's not like that everywhere. And I think part of the problem is that outside of the US, many of the people that go into sales to begin with, unlike in America, they actually have a medical background. So, if you're in Dubai or if you're in India, the people that are actually your medical representatives, many of them are pharmacists, many of them are PhDs. We see that. And, then there's another level who are the medical liaisons. And so the line's a little bit, more blurred than it is maybe in the United States. But I do see that we should have a firewall. But I will say, and this might sound a little controversial, what we're seeing is a significant decline in the number of reps in the country in general, not just again in the US, but outside of the US. I had a meeting yesterday with a woman who is in medical affairs in Turkey, and she was telling me that many of the big companies are replacing all the reps with MSLs.
Which really is, when you think about the CIA, I think it was GlaxoSmithKline from 2012, if I remember. So it's a little old at this point. But that was actually one of the problems, though, wasn't it? Where they were getting rid of the reps and telling MSLs, you need to take on that responsibility. Unfortunately, in that specific situation, and I believe GSK changed all of that in light of the CIA. But in light of that situation, one of the things that popped out was MSLs were given sales territories, and that obviously became a huge problem. So obviously, speaking to the point you were making a few seconds ago, the whole point is having that Chinese wall and making sure that they're functioning and have different roles. So how do you? We already have a question for us before we go too far. Christine's already asking this question: how can a research professional make a career pivot? What degree is required?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you want me to answer that question now?
Please.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Christine. So I think one of the things that's important is to arm yourself with information, kind of to understand the language and the knowledge of the world you're trying to go into. So I'm a big proponent of continued professional development. So whether it's you go out and get a degree that focuses on the area you want to go in, presumably if you're talking about medical affairs, from my perspective, I'd highly recommend obviously the board certification in medical affairs, because it gives you that specialized knowledge that you need and credibility. Actually, it's interesting. We collect data on the people that get board certified who are not in industry, and about 90% of the time, those people land a role in the industry within 3 months. And I was talking to a leader today who was the head of a top 5 pharma. He oversaw thousands of people in medical globally. And he was telling me, if I get 5 candidates and they're all the same, let's say, but one has board certification or some kind of additional training, it shows me that they've gone above and beyond. So that's always my recommendation, because it shows initiative and, you're able to hit the ground running more quickly.
So that speaks to obviously the certification, but what is the base degree you recommend? Can someone, for example, with a bachelor's degree realistically break into being an MSL, or do you generally see terminal degrees?
You generally see terminal degrees, but there are certain folks that don't have a terminal degree, PAs, for example, nurses, where, they don't have that advanced degree, people that have even masters in pharmacy from other countries. And we do see them, they break in. Of course, the predominant is the MD, PhD, and the PharmD.
And that really brings that next question, right? So we've got this situation where we've got MDs, PhDs, PharmDs, and do you see that because do you see those degrees being the focus because those are terminal degrees and it's less of an issue with, for example, the DOJ or the OIG after the fact, and you're going, we're using scientists, what more do you want from them? Or is it because they're qualified in a more unique way, if you will?
I think it's a combination. So, if you go to our website, you'll see one of the people that endorses what we do is the current interim head of the FDA, Janet Woodcock. And I know Janet pretty well. We've met a few times and spoken. And for medical affairs, from the FDA's perspective, the DOJ's perspective, they certainly recognize that there's a difference, but they still have obviously certain boundaries in place, even for medical, right? Um, I think from the pharma industry's end, certainly having again that advanced degree, I think it gives people more access. Let's be honest, right? One of the biggest reasons why medical came about, and increased so much in the late 90s, early 2000s was that was the height of when you had tons and tons of reps, right? It was Merck versus Pfizer. It was Celebrex versus Vioxx. It was Zocor versus Lipitor. It was those days in the early 2000s. And you had thousands of reps, around the country. And so access was becoming limited. Doctors began to minimize access to reps. And one of the workarounds was really the medical liaison. And this is why what you said earlier about GSK was really important. Purdue did the same thing when they got hit with the opioid issue. They kind of substituted with medical people, and this is why I've been advocating so hard for having a separate credential for medical, because it protects the integrity of what we do. It separates us from commercial, and I think it's so important.
So it's interesting you talk about that separation from commercial because as you use the analogy of the 1990s where there were so many reps on the ground. But I guess the question that came out of it is my experience is that right now at least I every so often still work as a pharmacist, but the idea is that your access gets removed because healthcare professionals start saying I don't trust industry sending people to me. So how do you work to help ensure that that trust remains in place and potentially gets stronger between MSLs and pharma?
It's a really good question. So we actually did a survey of about 1,200 key opinion leaders, and we asked them, if Darshan or Will was board certified in medical affairs, would it matter when it came to trust and credibility and competence? 87% of them said absolutely it would matter. And I think the key is having something independent of the industry that says, yes, you are accredited and certified to do what you do. You meet certain core standards. As you know, as a pharmacist, it's no different than you went to pharmacy school, but you can't go practice. What do you have to do? You have to get a license, because the state has to make sure you meet certain requirements. And this is the same thing. And arguably, a medical affairs professional, an MSL, is doing work just as important. They're impacting patient lives, on a macro scale level, but they are. I was a medical director at a company where, I was heavily involved in designing clinical trials that would really impact patients' lives and what they were exposed to. We really play a big role. So we need to have something that ensures that there's a uniform standard. And this is why I think it's so important. This is why we were invited back in March by the United States Congress Health Subcommittee. I don't know if you know that, but we were invited back in March. Was led by Congressman Brett Guthrie from the great state of Kentucky. And we talked about this issue at length. We actually even had Tina Canmaz, who is a dean at St. John's College of Pharmacy. And she was talking about how at pharmacy school, they're not necessarily preparing folks to do what we're doing in industry. And that came from someone who's, a leader in academia within pharmacy. So I think, it's time. We're in a new era today. We're in a new era. And can I tell you something else? And this is, again, going to sound controversial.
Please.
But you have a lot of folks in medical affairs. And I'm saying, look, I was in medical affairs for 15 years. You have a lot of people in medical affairs who've been around for 20, 25 years, kind of this old guard mentality. It's like, we don't need that. We don't need to have a separate credential. This is not important. And I have to say, we have to step into the future. That's like saying, back in investment banking days when equity research and investment bankers could work side by side. I mean, then we had the fall and then we had the separation, right? So why are we waiting for another opioid crisis, another issue? Why don't we take charge and make a change now?
It's funny you talk about this. I'm trying to make sure I'm gonna raise something even more controversial than what you just said, because I'm curious what your take on it is, because I think you're saying it without saying it. So I apologize if I'm putting words in your mouth. But at this moment, what you have is a certification. But what you advocated for in the last few sentences is a licensing of medical affairs. Is that accurate, or did I misread what you said?
So licensing the medical affairs would try to make a requirement, right, at a
Right.
state level, and
Yeah.
that's not something we are advocating for in terms of mandates. Although I will tell you, many of the policymakers we've spoken to, including within the Congress, the U.S. Congress, many of them would like to see that. Okay, from the ACMA perspective, we are not necessarily looking for that. We're looking for folks to voluntarily adopt it. No different than how we adopt pharmacode. As you know, pharmacode is voluntary. It's
Yeah.
not mandated. And I'm an advocate for that, right? I think we do a lot of good things in the industry, and we should, as an industry, go above and beyond. We don't want it mandated on us. But that's not to say that we can control that, right? So whether or not that happens, that's not necessarily within our control, ultimately, from a legislative perspective. But we do feel like, as an industry, if we adopted it, it would certainly show policymakers, you know what, our industry has gone above and beyond to do something and demonstrate that we have this independent accreditation that really separates us from sales and what they do.
So thank you for clarifying. Because what I'm hearing you say is that independence and that self-regulation will prevent, or at least address, a lot of the concerns that lawmakers have. Because let's be honest, whether or not we like it, pharma doesn't have the best reputation in the world.
No.
Admittedly, COVID helped us because we came in, we helped avoid literally, to the extent we had a global pandemic, it could have been a lot worse. But that information still needs to go out. And right now we're struggling with trust. So what you're saying is having that independent third-party perspective would help in addressing those issues of trust. But
Yes.
let me take that next step. Does it need to be MSLs who have that problem, who need to be trusted, or should we also have a similar take on sales reps?
It's a great question, and I get that question a lot. From our perspective, the focus is on medical because of what I said earlier. The average rep, their time with a physician is very short. I think it's 1 to 2 minutes. You might know better than me in terms of the average time. It's very, very short. The average time of an MSL or a medical director with a healthcare provider is about 45 minutes. So let's be honest. Who's really making an impact in terms of informing decision making from a clinical standpoint? Really, it's the medical people. It's not so much sales reps. And we also know that once physicians graduate, the majority of their education comes from where? It comes from education supported by the pharma industry. And the third thing I would say is the majority of research globally, over 65%, is funded by who? By the private industry, by the pharma industry. So we can't get around it, whether you agree or disagree. The pharma industry plays a massive role in helping to shape clinicians' perspective once they're out of medical school. And then who's at the forefront is medical affairs and medical folks, because they're the ones that have the time with these physicians.
So that's interesting. You talk about the time with the physician, which I think is critical. I didn't know these numbers, 1 to 2 minutes versus 45 minutes. Obviously, a huge difference between those two. But I guess my question is, you have armies of sales reps, so each of them getting 1 to 2 minutes versus it's a medical science liaison specifically getting into to see a physician. Once that trust comes in, you are a pharmacist, you are a PhD, you are an MD. I can trust you. I'll spend the time with you because you can answer questions I actually have actual questions about. My question to you is, in that scenario, how do you get them past the gatekeeper? Because the gatekeeper is going, to me, you're just pharma.
Right. You're talking from the medical side.
I'm talking from the healthcare practitioner who's saying that I don't want to talk to pharma. They don't draw that distinction of medical science liaison versus.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So how do you help people address that?
Well, one of the things I think that we've done is really to get a lot more awareness around the value of board certification for medical and advocating for medical within the community. So we work with a lot of the hospitals and health systems, so I think them being aware that medical really is different, and they're different because of this reason, because they understand it. Matter of fact, this is interesting data for you. 40% of the people that are board certified are MDs. are MDs. Then the other 60% are a mix of PharmDs and PhDs. But the majority are actually MDs. And I think it's because MDs get that. They get that idea of you need to have some type of board certification. It gives you a layer of credibility, that layer of trust. And I want to just go back to one thing that you said earlier when you were talking about the trust in the industry. You're right. COVID helped a little bit, although there's still a lot of COVID, vaccine hesitancy. But it's hard to imagine now, 2019, at the end of 2019, the Gallup poll rated the industry, the pharma industry, the lowest of 25 industries in terms of trust by the American people. So you can look that up. So the Gallup poll in 2019 showed that. And, a lot of that was because of the opioid crisis. And let's be honest, part of that was because there were companies, that we won't mention here, that mischaracterized data in clinical trials for the use of opioid drugs. And so we did play a role. I'm not saying that, if that wasn't there, that'd be completely gone, but we played some role is my point. And I'll tell you something interesting. I had dinner about 2.5 years ago with a guy. His name is Richard Morgan. He was actually on Dr. Oz, and he was a physician, very well respected, who actually ended up selling opioids in conjunction with one of the big pharma companies. They used him, and he was involved with kickbacks. He ended up going to jail. And after serving 10 years, came out. He's reformed now. He's a professor at a medical school. But my point is that he was telling me that the companies were coming in there very aggressively pushing these opioid products. I mean, it was firsthand. He was involved in it, and which is one of the reasons why he really supports what we're trying to do, because he saw the industry's role firsthand. You know what I mean?
I do. So let's take a step back. We've been speaking about the role of MSLs and trust and a lot of these issues sort of where we are right now. We've also briefly touched on this concept of where are we going as an industry in the context of certifications, in the context of is there a need for licensing and that may not be necessary. But let's take a step back, which is going back to a comment you made, which is you talked about how pharmacy schools don't prep students for that pathway. And my question to you is, number one, based on your conversations, why is that? Because I went through pharmacy school, and I can tell you that what we were all prepped for, at least in my school, we were prepped and pushed towards hospital pharmacy. Industry is bad. That is the dark side. Don't go there. And you've heard that 1,000 times from a lot of other people, I'm imagining, based on your smile and the fact that you're nodding. My question to you is, how do you tell students coming out that there is great job satisfaction here? There is still a chance to make an impact on patient lives. There is a way to use the knowledge you've gained in a way that is productive and helpful. So what steps have you taken to have that happen?
Yeah. So what we do is we actually, and I'm proud of this at the ACMA, we actually serve as a rotation site for pharmacy students. So they actually do their industry rotations with us. We work with many of the different schools in the area here, Rutgers and FDU and others. And that's one thing that we do. And they get a really great experience and learn about the industry. But we also give a lot of talks and seminars, career seminars, all over the country. We've done it. Last year, we did a whole bunch of pharmacy schools. We did a lot of PhD programs, medical schools, spoke at even going to Harvard Medical and Yale and a bunch. It was a great experience. And it was a lot of fun. And people, to your point, weren't aware of what we were doing. We also support a scholarship at UIC College of Pharmacy in Chicago, where there's an ACMA Medical Affairs Scholarship. So every year, the recipient gets $25,000 scholarship. And we give that to them to help support a career that they would want to pursue within the pharmaceutical industry. And that's something, again, we're very, very proud of. And we also have the Medical Affairs Scholarship Program within the ACMA. And so you can apply for a scholarship directly to the ACMA, and that scholarship will afford you the ability to gain access to any of the programs that we offer. One of the best stories that we had was a woman who was from Kazakhstan. She was from Kazakhstan. She was a woman that was working in the industry, had just began, really wanted to upskill herself because she didn't have that opportunity in Kazakhstan. She found us through a colleague who she knew in Russia, reached out. She was making $200 a month. And it was a great story. I always remember that story. And she applied for the scholarship. We gave it to her. And then she reached out to us, about 2 years ago and said, it's really made a difference. And she ended up moving to another part of Europe, and she's doing great now. But those are always stories that resonate with me, and ways that we try to help people that are coming out or people that maybe are in lower socioeconomic situations.
Just out of curiosity, in this specific, and we don't want to identify her for GDPR reasons, obviously, but ignoring that part of it, this woman, was she already a MSL where she was, or was she considering becoming an MSL?
She was just starting out in the industry. So she was internal within medical, but like I think it was like a medical manager or something like that. And she was interested in being an MSL and just upskilling herself because she hadn't really had, because you have to remember something in many of these other countries, there's not a lot of options to them that are available that give them the options to upskill and broaden their skill set. And we've seen a huge increase in the last few years in Singapore and the UAE and India. India is a big one. In China, in several parts of Europe, where people are really, there's just a big demand for this type of work, and it's great. It's great to be able to work in these countries.
So are you doing work internationally? Or are you sort of spreading the word off being an MSL internationally?
We are. So like I mentioned, there's folks that are board certified by us in 75 countries. 75 countries. Yeah, it's pretty cool. If you were to tell me that a few years ago, I never would have believed that would have happened. But yeah, so it's all over the world. This is global.
Okay. So what I'm hearing then is that you are making the fundamental problem I'm hearing you identify, for lack of a better term, is lack of awareness of the potential and the work that MSLs do. And you've tried to address that in a variety of different ways, whether you're talking at the pharmacy student level, where you're talking about becoming a rotation site, you're talking about doing seminars and scholarships and all that good stuff. But you're also doing that at the congressional level, where you're talking to lawmakers, and you're talking to, for example, and we literally have run out of time already, but I wanted to get into this. You're talking next week at the U.S. Attorney General's Alliance meeting, where you're going to be talking to them about exactly these issues as well.
Yes.
So what I'm hearing you say is awareness is a key component of how you're trying to address this this lack of information about what MSLs do.
Yeah.
And you're hoping that addresses the issues of trust that are deep within society against the pharma industry, if you will.
I do. I think it can certainly help. And I think if people are listening who are in medical affairs in the MSL world, I don't think sometimes they're necessarily always aware of that outside perspective. When I worked in pharma, you just kind of focus on your job and what you do, and you're seeing your KOLs or whatever. You're not thinking about what's happening around you. But I would say if you really want to protect the integrity of your role long term, we've got to open our eyes and look around and say, okay, what's going on and where is the tide shifting to? And we have to step in, like I said, into the future and realize that we need to have something that protects what we do. So I'm excited about what the future has to bring.
It's funny you say that. That was something that Christine put up literally 20 minutes ago, going step into the future. So you're both vibing at the same moment. So as you know, well, I usually aim for these to be about 15 to 20 minutes, just sort of get a general feel for the conversation. We're already at double that because you're just an incredible person to talk to about this.
That's very nice of you.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is ask you 3 questions, and then we'll do a quick summary of where we are. So the first question for you, based on what we've talked about, what is one question you'd like to ask the audience?
I'd like to ask the audience if prior to this meeting, they realized what some of these issues were around medical affairs and MSLs, or if this was new to them.
There you go. Very cool. I knew of them. So I usually try to answer the question as the first person. I was aware of these issues, but yes, I'd be curious if other people had the same question that people didn't know.
Right.
So definitely interested. Please write. And by the way, Will, how can people reach out to you if they have questions?
They can follow me on LinkedIn. They can follow me on Instagram, Will_Solomon. They can email me at info@acmainfo.org. They can reach us directly there at the company.
Very, very cool. And my next two questions. What is the most memorable thing that happened to you in the last month?
In the last month? Oh, wow. I would say the most memorable thing was probably the interaction I had with that patient advocate, and really just hearing her story about the situation with her son and the disease state and how medical can really help, and the impact that she thinks ACMA can have, and the information they give their doctor. That story really resonated with me. It really did.
I'm going to ask you to repeat it because I think we actually discussed that story before we got online.
Yeah. Oh, did we? Okay. So I was just going to say that, there was a patient advocate who was, we were meeting with and was telling us that what we do at the ACMA is so important because she wants to, make sure that a lot of times her physicians who don't always know how to treat a disease or don't have all the latest information are relying on medical. So medical having the highest standards of knowledge and that type of stuff really could impact her and her son and the kind of the progression of the disease. So that just stuck with me.
Very, very cool. And last question for you. What did you learn this week?
This week, well, I would say, the probably the biggest thing I learned is that making sure that you take care of your health. This is kind of more of a personal thing, is really important. Making sure that you stay up to date with your physician, just for your own personal health, is critical. And I would say having good family around that watches out for you and takes care of you. I think sometimes we underappreciate that, and I think this week I appreciated it.
Very, very cool. I'm going to do a quick summary of what we discussed. We landed up talking about how you've been meeting with patient advocates, and you actually just discussed that. We talked a little bit about this concept of a minimal standard of excellence. We then talked about, and this is something you said, which I really like the term, MSLs are the face of the industry, which I think is really interesting, very exciting.
Right.
Because there's so many faces, and in the end, healthcare practitioners are seeing MSL, they're seeing reps, and those are your faces. The goal of MSLs, as you pointed out, is to educate the community on the disease state, help community development of new data, on how to use it. You pointed out this really interesting statistic, which I did not know about, which was the growth in the last 10 years has been about 300%, which is crazy. And that's not just in the US, it's globally, if I understand correctly.
It's global, yeah.
Yeah. You did talk about how MSLs are different from sales reps in that there could be a potential conflict of interest in the case of sales reps, which you don't really have in the case of MSLs, mostly because they're required by law to actually not be biased, if you will. That's the entire point. We then spoke a little bit about just how do you address the issues of trust and the gap in trust between healthcare practitioners and MSLs and industry, and the types of standards that probably should be in place. We then went into, you made a really interesting comment, which I'd never heard before, which was the average rep time is usually between 1 to 2 minutes versus the average MSL or a medical director time is about 45 minutes. So it's night and day, if you will. It really concerns me if your average rep time is 1 to 2 minutes, because that means that's what half of the people are getting less than that, which means that I don't know how you do anything in 30 seconds.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That's crazy to me. We then spoke a little bit about how ACMA is actually going in and impacting pharmacy schools themselves and spreading the word. And you talked a little bit about being a rotation site, doing talks and seminars, having a scholarship, and having the actual ACMA Medical Affairs Scholarship, which is separate as well. And you threw out another interesting number. I've always heard that the maximum number of MSLs are pharmacists, which I think is interesting. But what you did is add the last piece, which is MDs tend to be about 40% of the people who get board certified.
Board certified, yep.
Which I think is awesome. Did I miss anything?
No, you got it.
Perfect. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Will. He can be reached out. Again, Will, where can they find you?
Medicalaffairsspecialist.org. You can go to our website, or you could find me on LinkedIn, William Solomon.
Perfect. And if you like this podcast, please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can find me on Twitter, DarshanTalks.com. On Twitter, DarshanTalks, or on our website at DarshanTalks.com. Thanks again, Will. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.